My name is John Yazbek, and this is Alina Rai, and together we are the co-chairs of the Academics, Research, and Careers Committee of the Graduate Student Council. We're known as ARC, if you guys have seen any of our events being advertised. So we'd like to welcome you today at our first panel, which is going to be a panel on careers in publishing. And this is going to be a series of panels on alternative careers for grad students. So look out for more emails in the spring, starting in February and in March, about the other panels that we're going to plan. And the panel today is co-organized actually by MIT Libraries, and mainly by Catherine Dunn, who did most of the job for this event. We just helped her out with it. So today we hope to cover topics such as what journal and book editors do, what the difference is between scholarly publishing and journalism, some topics about science writing, and most importantly, I think what a lot of you here are interested in is how to find publishing jobs. So with us today, we have a great group of panelists, actually. They have a lot of experience in the field, and they're going to be here to share their experiences, and then later on to answer your questions in a Q&A format. So our panelists include Ada Brunstein, Executive Editor and Acquisitions Group Leader at Oxford University Press, who previously worked as an editor in brain sciences, computer science, and linguistics at the Cambridge University Press, MIT Press, and Blackwell Publishing. So Ada, actually I screwed up her name. I asked her before what your name is. She said Ada, and then I said Ada again, but this is Ada here. We also have Dr. Jennifer Griffiths, Editorial Development Manager for North America at the Royal Society of Chemistry, who has a PhD in biological chemistry and previously worked at the American Chemical Society. We also have Wade Rausch, yeah, great, Acting Director of Knight Science Journalism at MIT, who has a PhD from MIT's program in Science, Technology, and Society, and spent 20 years as a reporter, writer, and editor. So the way this is going to work is we're going to have each panelist talk for about 10 to 15 minutes. Some of them have slides, some don't. And then they're going to talk about their experiences, their backgrounds. And after that, we're going to have a Q&A sessions where you can feel free to come up and ask your questions. We have a microphone over there. And we're going to cut it off at around 3:30, 3:35. After that, you can feel free to stay here. The panelists are going to be here for about 10, 20 minutes after. You can feel free to stay here and talk to them. We're going to have some refreshments, such as cookies and coffee. But please remember, don't bring anything in here. So welcome, everyone, and enjoy. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'm first. Can everybody hear me? Okay? Okay, good. So as he said, I work for the Royal Society of Chemistry. After I got my PhD, I went and did a postdoc, and it became fairly clear very quickly during my postdoc that I really didn't want to be doing research anymore. And so I looked around at different alternative careers and really hadn't gotten a lot of information about that during my PhD work. And I was fairly lucky to find publishing, and it's turned out to be a really great career for me. And I'll tell you why it's a good career. So first, just a little bit about the Royal Society of Chemistry. Our main offices are actually in the UK, as you can probably guess from the title Royal. But we have offices all over the world. We have two here in the US, one in Philadelphia, which is our sales office, and one in DC, which is where I'm based with the rest of our publishing team. But we have them in India, China, Japan, Brazil, and Germany. So really all over the world. So what we publish, so we have journals, and so we publish both general chemistry journals. I think most people are very familiar with ChemCom if you spent any time in the chemical sciences. But we also have Chemical Science, which is our newer flagship journal that started in 2010, and ChemSoc Rev, our reviews journal. We also publish subspecialty journals, so Dalton, our inorganic journal, Analyst. We have a pretty good materials chemistry portfolio. Physical, and then we also publish some sub-field journals that are much more specialized. We also publish books. I'm not going to talk about our books program today because we have Ada here to do that. We publish magazines, which again, Wade will cover from his organization. And then we also have databases. So databases are something that's a growing field within publishing because there's a lot of talk now about open data, data sharing, things like that. So that's something we've been expanding into recently. So what do publishers do? So how many of you have published a paper? Actually, okay, good number of you. So you've been through the peer review process, so you probably have a pretty good idea of how this works. But publishers are integral to the whole publishing process. And so, you know, when you submit your article, you're looking for a journal that's a trusted brand. You're looking for an online submission system that's not horrendous and difficult to navigate. During the peer review process, we're kind of the hub of the whole process, that we're the liaison between all of the parties, the reviewers and the editors. And then we do the editing and typesetting and proofing, which is probably something you're really familiar with because that's the part that's more outwardly facing. But then we also want to make sure that your article is findable. So we host your article, we give it visibility and accessibility, and something people don't often think about is that we have to make sure that it's going to be available forever. So there are backup systems so that if, God forbid, our publishing platform went down, your papers would still be automatically available. So as far as the industry goes, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but it's a very large industry. $23.5 billion in 2012, and about half of that comes from the US. So the US is a huge part of the publishing system. And 2.4 million articles published in 2013, according to Scopus, and that number has grown over the last years. You can see chemistry down there at number 7, and these are not going to add up to 2.4 million because some articles will be classified in more than one category. So the thing that I really like about this is that even though I'm not doing science anymore, I still feel like I'm part of the research community. I go out to conferences, I get to talk to scientists, I get to read about science, and I can help scientists communicate their work, which is really important. In this career, there's opportunities for lots of skills that maybe you haven't had a whole lot of chance to develop within the structure of scientific research. Strategic thinking, you have to be very good at networking. So, you'll do some of that as a student when you go to conferences, but it's a skill that you really, really need to develop because creating those kind of personal relationships is very important in this business. Business acumen, that's something that I basically knew nothing about when I started, and so learning about that has been really interesting. And I mentioned travel. I travel a lot, so going out to places like this, meeting with professors, going to conferences, that kind of thing is a big part of the job. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of jobs actually at the RSC because my job is actually somewhat rare in the publishing industry. So I fall in our publishing structure under this international category, and I'll tell you exactly what I do in a minute. We also have executive editors, and these are called different things at different publishers. Sometimes they're called managing editors, but these job titles you'll see much more often than my job title. And they're the ones that are responsible for the journals. And so this is a few of our executive editors. These are based in Cambridge. There's actually 10 of them total. 9 are in Cambridge, and then 1 is in our China office. We have a set of journals that are actually co-publications with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and so those are run out of our Beijing office. So the job of the executive editor is to basically be the face of the journal. They're developing the profile. They look at a lot of statistics, trying to increase submissions, publications. They're managers, so sorry about the abbreviations there, but JD stands for Journals Development, and EP is Editorial Production. So there's a whole team of people who work on these journals, and these people are really the ones that are leading the teams. They're responsible for the journal content, so they work with the editorial boards to figure out what we want to have in the journal, what the topics are that will be of the most interest. They do a lot of people management, so editorial and advisory boards. You can imagine that professors can be very headstrong sometimes, and so you have to have very good people skills in order to manage them. And then they have some budgetary responsibilities, which is probably the least interesting part of the job. So what I do, so I am based, like I said, here in the States. You can probably tell that I'm not British. And so we have an office. I have a team of 3 people, including me. Lauren and Jenny, who are the other 2 pictured up here, are actually assistant editorial development managers. And so what we do is we focus on the US and Canada, and we're trying to raise the profile of the journals in this region, and ultimately to increase the quality and the number of submissions that are coming from here. So we do strategic planning for the region, which means looking at a lot of data, looking at trends, looking at who's publishing where, who's publishing in our competitors, who would we like to be publishing in our journal, who should we be, inviting to publish, things like that. It really is a lot of relationship building. So, traveling, going to conferences, talking to people, like I said before. We're looking for leads for commissioning. So if we hear about an interesting piece of research when we're out talking to people, or if we see a talk at a conference, we bring that back, and then somebody in Cambridge might commission that. And then publicity, again, that's part of raising the profile. So the kinds of skills that you'll need for this, strategic thinking, innovation, influencing and negotiation, like I said, if you're dealing with people who maybe are a bit headstrong sometimes. Communication and interpersonal skills, both written and oral. Writing is a huge thing. I mean, this isn't journalism where you're going to be writing, articles, but being able to communicate and writing well, I think that'll serve you well for any job that you have. Teamwork, like I said, there's whole teams of people who work on these journals, and so you have to be able to work easily as part of a team. We require an advanced degree in science, as does the ACS for their publishing program. Some publishers won't, so sometimes the people who are managing the journals are coming from an English or a communications kind of background. It just depends. So this is the question now that I'm sure you're all thinking is, how do I get a job like this? I think that the most important thing is to network. So it's great that you're here today, and certainly come up and talk to us specifically if you have, a particular interest in this field. But you can also find us in other places. We go to conferences a lot. The small conferences, it's a little bit easier to find us because if you've got a roster of attendees, you can definitely pick us out. The larger conferences, it can be a little bit more difficult. We tend to be at receptions, sometimes at the booth if we have a booth, but if we're not there, usually the people who would be manning the booth could probably pass your name on to us, and a lot of us are happy to talk to you if you're interested. There are publishing conferences and events, and there's some publishing societies, which I'll give you the information for at the end. We might be at your institution, like I am today. And you can email if you can find our information. I mean, certainly you don't need to sell yourself, but if you just sort of politely ask if you can ask some questions, I usually would be happy to email somebody or talk to them on the phone if they have a real interest in the industry. Another thing that you can do is express your interest to your advisor or another professor in the department. So if you know somebody in your department, a professor who's an editor for a journal, definitely talk to them because they can probably give you the information of the publishing contact they have at their journal. You can learn about issues in scientific publishing. So there's something called the Scholarly Kitchen blog. So if you want to read about the things that publishers are talking about, that's a good place to look. And if you came into an interview with me and were able to discuss some of the issues in publishing, I'd be incredibly impressed. There are courses, there are free webinars, things like that, that the scholarly societies, publishing societies do run. Writing in business, developing that sort of thing. And one thing that stood out to me when I was recruiting was people who had gone to the trouble to organize something. So when I got resumes in for the 2 positions that I hired recently, got a lot of great resumes for a graduate student. You looked wonderful on paper, they had publications, but I had no way to assess the kind of interpersonal skills that they had just from that piece of paper. And so the people who stood out to me were ones that had been involved outside of the lab in things like graduate student associations, for example, or if they had organized like a Gordon Research Seminar. I had one person who had done that. Departmental events, things like that. That's what I was looking for, was showing that you were good at teamwork, you were good at leading. Those are the things that stood out. This is just general advice. So when you apply, make sure that you highlight the correct skills. So read the job ad, Make sure you're pulling out the pieces, the specific pieces from your experience that would address the skills that are in the ad. Make sure you tailor your application. So I had several resumes come in where they hadn't even bothered to change the objective. So they told me that they wanted a career in industry, and I thought, why are you applying for a publishing job? So that one, of course, got eliminated very quickly. And prepare for the interview. Make sure that you completely understand the role, and certainly if there are parts of it you don't, ask. Make sure that you know the company, you know what they publish, and prepare for questions. Certainly there's a set of questions out there that everybody sort of hates, the competency questions, the strength and weaknesses questions. You can find those things on job advice sites, and make sure that you have in your head an answer to the general sort of questions that may be asked. So so I think that's it. So this is the information about the different scholarly publishing societies, and so you can definitely find more information at the Society for Scholarly Publishing. They have a whole section on science careers, but you can take a look at these other sites as well, and certainly if you just want to email me, I can send those to you if you don't want to copy it all down right now. And actually my card is up there too. If you don't even want to copy my email address down, just grab one of those. So thank you, and I think we're going to do questions, I guess, at the end, right? Okay. That was all right. Okay. I forgot to look at my watch when we started. So you're close to this, right? Do I need to unplug this? Oh, no? Oh.
So I'm Anna Bronstein. I'm the executive editor in digital reference at Oxford University Press. Is this better? Mm-hmm. Okay. For most of my publishing career, I worked in books publishing, so that's mostly what I will talk about. I first got into publishing when I was working on a PhD in linguistics and working at the same time working full-time for a technology company here in Cambridge. And after 7 years of that, I pretty much burned out on the whole thing. Left the PhD program and decided to leave my job as well and try to find something that that would keep me close to academia, keep me close to linguistics, but without going into academia and into research. I didn't really know exactly what I was looking for because I had no idea what publishing jobs were out there. I didn't know what editors did. I really didn't know what I was looking for. I was just kind of scanning job ads, and I saw an ad for an acquisitions editor. And they wanted a few years of publishing experience, but the job description resonated with me enough that I contacted the publisher. It was Blackwell at the time, and got an interview, and was lucky enough to enter the industry in that way. So I bring this up because I didn't know that there were different kinds of editors. I didn't know what editors did, and so I thought we could start with at least a brief overview of, when you see an editorial job, it's good to know that there's no one kind of editor. So the job ads you'll see are generally for copy editors, who are the ones who are going through every manuscript line by line, checking for grammar, style, all that kind of really important stuff that makes a manuscript readable. Development editors tend to be used less in scholarly publishing, more in trade publishing. They do things like move around chapters and paragraphs, really kind of massage the text in a more in-depth way. Acquisitions and commissioning editors, which is the role that I've had, we're sort of the gatekeepers. We decide what to publish and what not to publish. So what does that mean, and how do we do that exactly? So there are two approaches. One is a little bit of a more passive role. We, as the point person in any given subject, for the publisher you're working for, the manuscripts and proposals all come to you. So you go through your inbox and you look at every single proposal that comes in, and you try to figure out what's viable and what isn't, what should be sent out for review and what just isn't appropriate. The other approach is a more active role where you are basically coming up with the book idea. It's more of a matchmaking role. You come up with the idea, you think of authors who might be not only appropriate but hopefully willing to turn that idea into a book, and you write the proposal together, or kind of develop the idea together. In most acquisitions or commissioning editor roles, you will be taking both approaches. That part of the job is extremely rewarding. The kind of generating ideas and finding authors is extremely rewarding. In fact, I think one of my favorite moments in my publishing career has been when I worked with an author who proposed a book that I really didn't want to publish. It didn't seem interesting or relevant, and he told me that he would love to send me a proposal for the book once he finishes this paper he was writing on a totally different topic. The topic of the paper was fascinating, and I ended up working with him to turn that into a book instead, and it just worked out really well. And that's rewarding because you really feel like you're part of the creative process. You really feel like you're playing an active role in putting information out there that otherwise maybe would not have gotten out there in the same way. So what happens next? So you've got the proposal, you've sent it out for review. I just want to take you through a little bit of the arc of kind of the life of the book, because as an acquisitions editor, you're kind of responsible for the entire process from beginning to end. So once you have the proposal reviewed, you have to put together a detailed financial plan. And this kind of speaks a little bit to one of the points that, that Jennifer raised, where it's, I mean, this is a business. There are kind of financial details and skills that you have to think about for every single book project. So for every book, you put together a plan that takes into account how much you're paying copy editors, what the manufacturing costs are, how much you're paying for the cover image, the color images that go into some of the books, how you're pricing the book. So that kind of financial thinking goes into every single book project that goes through your desk. And then there are, of course, the finances of the contract that you're making with the author, royalties, grants, advances. So that's a big part of the initial phase of the process. Once the proposal is done and the reviews are in and the contract is signed, then you're pretty much waiting for the manuscript. Once that comes in, you start the review process again, because the idea for a book is very different from what actually materializes a year later. And when you finally have the manuscript in shape for publication, you work very closely with other departments in the press. So production departments, marketing departments, publicity in some cases. As was mentioned earlier, interpersonal skills are extremely important. You're always working with people in this job, people with different skill levels in different departments, and some academics, some not. It just, you have to be ready to really have conversations with a huge range of personality types and backgrounds, and you have to love that process. A lot of teamwork is involved. So one of the other things that I didn't know going into publishing is that actually many commissioning editors don't actually have a background in the fields that they're commissioning books in. So while some publishers will hire editors that have PhDs in the topics that they're hiring for, others don't. I started out in linguistics because that was my background, but I went on to do computer science, psychology, neuroscience, and now I'm doing a little bit of biology. So the question is, whether you have a background in the field or not, how do you actually inform all of these decisions that you have to make in order to make these book projects happen? The short answer is you talk to people, but you go to conferences, you look at what papers are being given, what talks are being given, you look at journals, you look at graduate and undergraduate programs, you look at what books are being assigned, what the curriculum looks like. But you basically talk to everyone, and we keep getting back to the point that it really is as much an industry of relationships as it is an industry of ideas. So with that, I just want to give you a little bit of kind of general advice about the industry, but also a little bit of a reality check about the industry, because I think the big elephant in the room is that the publishing industry is in a transitional stage right now, right? I mean, with the shift to digital, everyone's trying to figure out how to make digital products work. So a bunch of things to keep in mind. So every publisher, first of all, is different. You've got massive science publishers, you've got tiny little boutique publishers that publish fantastic books, and you've got everything in the middle. So there's no really one thing called the scholarly publisher. There are many, many different kinds, and it's really worth talking to people from different publishers to get a sense of what they're looking for, what their publishing plans are for the future. You'll get different answers from different people. Your degrees will definitely be an asset if you're looking for jobs in this industry, but it's important to remember that it is ultimately a business. So do come prepared to talk about the issues that are being discussed on blogs and at conferences. It's when you're hiring, you really want to know that you have a candidate who understands that they're not just going to be engaging with the ideas, that they really understand that it is about creating a product that you will have to find a market for. So it's important just to kind of acknowledge that. It is a really competitive industry. Editorial positions don't open up that often. People tend to stay in them for the long haul, which is a good sign. It's a sign that people are actually engaged with the work and love what they do. But it does make it, I mean, just to be realistic, it's a very competitive industry. The most traditional path into academic publishing is by becoming an editorial assistant first, and then you go from there. But there are things you can do to kind of, if you want to sort of skip that step. I mean, if you get freelance jobs as development editors or copy editors, kind of in the meantime, I don't know if you can do that while you're still in school, but if any kind of editorial work that you can get before you apply for a position as an acquisitions editor would be helpful on your resume. And it's worth saying that nobody goes into scholarly publishing for the money. We're not publishing 50 Shades of Grey. It's not that kind of publishing. And if we are, it's a book about optics. I mean, it's not, it's just scholarly publishing is an entirely different scale than publishers like Random House. So here are some resources. I think Jennifer had a much more comprehensive and useful list, but these are some places where you can look for job ads, and it's helpful just to see what people are looking for and what kinds of jobs are being posted. I'm also including a really good Tumblr that Life in Academic Publishing, nobody knows who runs it, but if you really just kind of want an honest glimpse of what it's like to sit in, have you seen that, actually? It's really funny. It's an irreverent reflection of what the day-to-day life of an academic publisher, of an editor in particular, is like, and it's worth looking at. And yeah, at conferences, come talk to us. Come to the exhibit hall, go to the booths, and talk to whoever is there. We're generally a very friendly bunch and happy to talk. I want to leave you with an image from this Tumblr that I found, which is when people talk about getting into the publishing industry, it's like, so you're going to suffer, but you're going to be happy about it. And that's pretty much in a nutshell. I mean, you're dealing with difficult personality types. Sometimes there's a lot of kind of management of authors, and there's some tough stuff. And as I said, it's not like a massive money-making industry in the way that some other industries are, but you will probably love it. That's all.
Great. Well, I'll start off and say exactly the same thing. I don't think anyone goes into journalism for the money. You go into it for the love of storytelling and the love of reporting and being able to follow your interests where they may lead and try and take the stuff you learn and repackage it to help other people see what you found so interesting. So it has its rewards, but they're mainly not financial. So I'm Wade Roush. I'm the acting director this year of the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship Program, which is part of the School of Humanities. Specifically, we're attached to the program in Science, Technology, and Society. And just briefly, I wanted to say what KSJ is so that you know where I'm coming from. And then I'll talk a little bit about what science journalism and technology journalism is, what it means to go into that field, what it takes to go into that field, and what kinds of outlets exist for science journalism these days, how you get started as a science or technology journalist, and so forth. But first, let me talk about the program and kind of situate it on campus. So we're lucky here at MIT in that we have sort of both sides of the bookshelf, if you will. We've got a really top-notch program that offers master's level training in science writing. It's called the Graduate Program in Science Writing, and it's part of the Comparative Media Studies and Writing program over in Building 14. And every year about 8 students or so enter that program, and they spend a year, it really is 12 months because there's 9 months of intensive classroom work followed by 3 months of practical internship work in the summer. So it's a 12-month program. And students come out of it with a master's degree in science communication and a lot of hands-on experience about what it's like to work in a newsroom and to produce real stories. So that's sort of on the first instance training, the incoming part of the profession. And then sort of on the other end of the bookshelf, as another bookend, we have the night program, which is a mid-career fellowship program for journalists who have already been pursuing their work for, say, 3 to 5 years minimum. And it's a chance for those kinds of folks to kind of step back and come to MIT and immerse themselves in the R&D culture and recharge their batteries, learn new sciences, learn new storytelling skills, network with potential contacts, build up their sort of notebook of story ideas, and then go back into their careers, whether they are freelancers or staff editors or writers, and sort of be recharged in terms of their science knowledge and their virtual Rolodex. So it's great for them because they get to hang out at MIT for a year and go wherever their interests lead them. There's also a $70,000 stipend attached, so it's kind of a sweet deal. It's actually one of the sweetest deals there is in science journalism to come to MIT and do this for a year. It's also a sweet deal for MIT because the journalists are coming here to hang out, and the institute gets to show them its best face, introduce top researchers from all 5 schools to these visiting journalists, and they go away sort of realizing, perhaps for the first time, what a rich sort of resource MIT is in terms of story ideas and ongoing research. So it's a two-way street, and the program is 32 years old now, and we're now in the midst of program sort of application recruiting for the 33rd class who will come in August. So that's what I do. I'm acting director of that program this year, and my job is to make sure that the fellows are having a successful year. And at the moment, I'm also, as I said, shepherding the applications for next year through that process. And thirdly, I'm coordinating a giant meeting that I hope you'll all attend in October. MIT is sort of like the Olympics of science journalism are going to happen at MIT in October. We bid on and successfully got the right to host the National Association of Science Writers meeting here at MIT in October from the 9th to the 13th, so that's a Columbus Day weekend. And basically, we're expecting 600 to 800 science writers, which is a big chunk of the entire world population of science writers, to come to Cambridge for 5 days in October. In a way, it'll be like a mini sort of hyper-compressed version of a fellowship where they're all going to meet top MIT researchers and folks from other local institutions and hear what kind of newsworthy science is going on. So that's also on my plate. So let's step back, though. What is science and technology journalism? So I think there are basically 2 halves to it. One half is the reporting and the investigation that goes on before you sort of even know what your story is. And then once you've done enough reporting to kind of have a sense that there is a story here, the other half is sitting down and trying to explain that in terms that your grandmother will understand. Now, the grandmothers of the world take a lot of abuse. That's always the sort of the example that people roll out, but it's actually a pretty good one because if you can explain a complicated science subject like I don't know, atmospheric chemistry or nuclear fusion or Ebola and how it is transmitted to a grandmother or to someone who doesn't have a special science background, you're doing your job. And that involves a whole set of special skills that have to do both with understanding the science and being able to ask the right questions, and then being able to translate it into a narrative that is compelling for the reader, but is also scientifically accurate. So that's actually the real trick, is telling a story without oversimplifying to the point where your source will cringe and say, I didn't say that, or that's totally distorted, or you left out half of half of the truth. That's the real trick. So who goes into science and technology journalism? I would say there are basically two paths, two types of people who wind up doing this work. So one group is composed of journalists who were covering other things other than science or technology, and through one path or another sort of serendipitously find themselves covering science and technology. And the other sort of typical direction into the field is people who start out in science and for whatever reason decide they aren't interested in being career scientists or PIs or bench scientists, and switch into a writing career and wind up writing about science or technology for a living. And both paths are equally valid, and eventually those people all wind up talking to each other, and you can't tell the difference between them until you kind of dig in and ask. Profession, I would say, takes a number of forms. And one big question is, obviously, how you're going to get paid. And the two main ways to get paid at doing this are to be on staff with a magazine or some other institution, a newspaper, a radio station, or to be a freelancer. And this is one of the careers where it is actually possible to make a go of being a freelancer and to have a decent income for yourself. It takes more independence, it takes more daring in a way to make this work on a freelance basis, but it is possible. And then once you've decided whether you want to go the staff or the freelance route, you kind of have to decide how you want to reach your audience. Do you want to be a print journalist? Do you want to go through the multiple, abundant online-only channels that exist today? Are you interested in audio storytelling, or maybe being on the radio, or being a podcast producer? Or are you motivated to make visual stories and record things on video or film or cartoons or graphics? Or are you kind of a blogger type and kind of in love with the idea of informal conversational storytelling? All of those paths into science journalism are equally valid, and you'll get a good introduction to those through any of the graduate level science writing programs. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a second. So the choice of your channel and how you want to tell your story is what's going to determine the choice of employer, the person who's paying you. So if you're really in love with print journalism, that probably means you're going to wind up writing for a local newspaper or a national newspaper or a regional or national magazine. If you're interested in online channels, that means starting your own website or finding a website, and there are dozens of them now that regularly cover science and technology. Huge range of online-only publications out there today. If you're interested in audio storytelling, that means you're pretty much limited to the public radio world in the United States. Either that or becoming an independent audio producer. And podcasting, as you may have heard, is sort of on the rebound. That's been said before, but I think it's really true this time. And it's an increasingly sort of interesting and viable way to make a living as a science or technology storyteller. If you're into TV, well, there's local stations, national stations, networks. I would say there's a fairly small number of opportunities for TV science journalists or medical journalists. But if you expand that a little bit and you talk about video, then the possibilities are much broader, because with the rise of YouTube and Vimeo and other open publishing platforms on the web, it's possible for anybody to basically learn how to do video production or animation and tell really compelling short-form stories for the web. So that's not something to overlook. Filmmaking, there's still a fine and kind of burgeoning tradition of independent science and technology documentary filmmaking. We have a fantastic genius filmmaker as one of our fellows over at the night program this year, and he's made films on everything from agriculture to Chinese food. And his most recent film was called In Search of General Tso, actually, and it's all about, like, where the heck did General Tso's chicken come from? Because it's not actually a Chinese dish. It's in theaters right now. And then lastly, blogging, which gives you sort of direct, unimpeded access and gives you the opportunity to build your own readership and your own fan base. The economic models to support blogging are not fully worked out, but it is an exciting route to go if you're not all that enamored with the idea of being inside some other big institution. So how do you get started as a science or technology journalist? I would say a couple of different ways into it that reflect the sort of the two populations I was talking about before. First of all, you can train as a journalist and get really good at reporting and writing, and then learn science, learn enough science or health or environment or technology or engineering or computer science to be a credible reporter when it comes to science topics. The other way in is to learn the science first and get a PhD and really master sort of the way scientists think and the way science works, and then go into journalism. Again, equally valid places. Both groups often, I run into people of both types who feel like it would be helpful to get some professional training along the way. You don't necessarily have to have a master's degree in science writing in order to get into this field. It's one of those kind of corners of the journalism world where you can get started without formal training. But for the folks who feel like they need help with gaining a basic mastery of reporting or story structure or the editing process or the publishing process, there are programs that teach that. And there are basically 4 that I would highly recommend. There are more than that, but there are 4 really top programs in the United States that will give you fantastic training in those areas. And the first one I already mentioned, it's the graduate program in science writing right here at MIT. The second one is right across the river at BU. They have a fantastic science journalism program at Boston University in the School of Communications. The third one is at NYU. They have a program called the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program in New York. And the fourth one is on the left coast at Santa Cruz. The UC Santa Cruz Science Communication Program has been churning out successful science writing graduates for a long time now. And Santa Cruz is way more beautiful than any of the other places. So I highly recommend that one too. So one of the questions I was asked to talk about was how useful it is to have a background in science if you're thinking about going into science journalism. And I would say that there are pros and cons, actually. I would say it's extremely useful in the sense that it does equip you to understand how science really works. And in your reporting, you're automatically going to be in a much better position to know what questions to ask your sources, what stories just even make sense, what papers coming out this week are actually groundbreaking and have sort of reliable methods and statistically valid conclusions. Basically, you'll have a much better BS detector from the get-go. You'll have an easier time just being able to figure out what to write about. And also, you'll be speaking the language of your sources. You wouldn't believe how important it is to be able to convince a scientist that you actually know what they do and you understand a little bit about their field. If you can drop a few terms that indicate that you actually know a little bit about genetics or about astronomy, you're likely to get them to open up to you much faster, and that's a huge advantage. On the other hand, I would say, coming from a science background, you might have a couple of challenges that you need to pay attention to and overcome. One is that you probably are going to have a little harder time putting yourself into the mindset of a non-expert or a lay reader, and therefore you're going to have to think harder about like what are the sort of the dumb questions that a lay reader would need to have answered to understand what's really going on. And it might be a little more embarrassing for you to ask those dumb questions, but you have to learn how to do that. Also, as a scientist, you've already been trained to think in a very specific way. You know, science is about hypothesizing and experimenting and collecting results and analyzing the results and then publishing. And so that's not at all the way that people actually run into science or medical topics in their real lives. And it's not why they're curious about. They're not coming at it from the point of view of how science is actually done. More often than not, they're having a medical crisis, or they're having to make some kind of consumer choice. And they have very practical reasons why they need to know what you're writing. So you have to kind of switch mindsets in order to connect with people. That said, the scientific method does, and the scientific process does provide a really nice sort of built-in storyline and a set of characters and a narrative to build your stories around. And the same kind of curiosity that drives you as a scientist, I think, can provide you with the questions you need to put together a film or a newspaper story, a magazine story, or a web comic, or whatever it is that you want to create. I think I'm out of time. I was going to talk a little bit about my own path into science journalism, but we can maybe cover that in the questions if that's interesting to you guys. So that's basically what I want to say. Thanks.
All right, so we are opening up the floor for questions. If you have any questions, please. I think this is a small enough room, so let's just shout them out. Does anyone have any questions?
So you mentioned that there are two kinds of science journals. You either get a PhD in science or go to science writing. How much did having a PhD versus just an undergrad degree really make a difference? If you're going to then go into getting a science writing degree afterwards.
I would say, if you know that you want to make the switch, make it as early as possible, because getting a PhD is a huge sort of opportunity cost. That's like at least 5 years that you could have been putting into mastering journalism skills. And there are plenty of science writers who have a science bachelor's degree or master's degree, but don't have PhD level experience. So I don't think that I would necessarily recommend getting a PhD as a rational path into science writing, even though that's what I did. So.
Other questions?
I guess this is a little bit towards the places you were in the full talk already, and more Untitled Publishing. I'm just kind of curious, what is it about publishing that actually attracted you, and what other career options were you considering at the time before you decided to?
Well, it was sort of serendipitous for me. I had just started looking around, and actually I came into it in a bit odd way. The first job that I was hired into was actually as a science writer, so it was more science journalism, because the journal I worked for had a front section kind of like Nature does. So it was science writing for scientists, so it wasn't to the lay public. And I don't actually think this would happen today, but I actually didn't have any experience when I applied for the job. They asked for a writing sample, but I didn't have anything published. I just sent them the writing sample, and this sort of contradicts what he's just said. They said, oh, she's got a great scientific background, and the writing's good enough, we can teach her the journalism. And maybe that's unique to a science publication, that's writing for scientists versus writing for the lay public. But and so then, unfortunately, that department was cut, and that's when I moved over to scholarly publishing. And so the thing that appeals about me, I think, sort of to both, probably in both fields, is the ability to still be involved in science. I still feel like I use my PhD. I'm not an expert in the subject that I studied anymore, really, because obviously that field has moved on quite a bit. But I still use the skills that I learned through my PhD. So, I say that the PhD taught me how to learn. So, during the process, you figure out how to get the information that you need to get as efficiently as possible. You learn how to read scientific papers. You learn, just what the structure of science is. And so the appeal to me was that I still got to use my PhD. I hadn't really gotten too far into investigating other careers at the time. But I do know people now who are in, they're patent examiners, somebody who works for the FDA Institute and things like that. So if there's other careers that you're interested in, I can probably put you in touch with people who could talk to you about it if you're interested. So.
Could you guys comment on the world of science textbook publishing at all?
That's probably for her.
What about it? Just how is it sort of different than the more academic scholarly publishing?
Yeah.
Is it even still a viable option?
Absolutely.
Is it,
Absolutely. And so when I was talking about scholarly publishing in my presentation, actually everything I said applied to textbooks and monographs and sort of various kinds of books. So, but to dig into textbooks a little bit more, the process is sort of the same. You still start out with a proposal. You have to rely a lot more on, when you do your market research, you look much more at syllabi, you look at curricula throughout the country or throughout the world, depending on what your market is. In some cases, for the bigger publishers, they have entire teams devoted to that market research, and the smaller publishers, the acquisitions editor and the marketing department or point of contact will take on the market research themselves. It's a different process from if you're publishing a monograph or you've got one author putting his or her point of view out there in a book. That requires, it's a different, the scope of the market research is different. So I guess that would be the biggest difference, is how wide a net you cast in your market research. It's definitely still a viable option. Every publisher I've worked for, let's use that shoe before, yes, every publisher I've worked for has published textbooks. In fact, I mean, some would say that the textbooks are, I hope I don't get in trouble for this, but that textbooks are kind of the financial backbone of some publishing programs because it's a very steady market. There's a reliable, consistent audience. Does that answer your question? Okay.
What would you say, in your experience, are either major hurdles or stumbling blocks that people coming from a science background will be publishing or science writing? What is your kind of advice or hurdles that you see people often experience?
I'll start. So I think you just need to be sure before you go that route that you're interested either in the whole sort of process of book production or journal production in the case of scholarly publishing and the business around that Jennifer and Ada have both spoken about, or in the case of journalism that you just really love to tell stories, and that, because I think that the difficult part of this, of both ends of this profession, is that you don't hear a lot from your audience. There's not a ton of contact with the people who are reading your stuff unless you're a blogger and you take the time to have like a healthy social media presence and you're building a fan base around your work. Most journalists I know, and certainly most sort of book editors, would be hard pressed to find a single person who has read their piece. It's getting read because you can see the web analytics, but finding an actual reader can sometimes be hard. So you have to kind of trust that you're doing something good for the world, and that by telling well-constructed stories, you're actually adding to sort of the net supply of understanding in the world. But you have to sort of take it on faith. And you have to be driven by your own passion for storytelling. So you just have to make sure you have that, and if you don't, that would be a warning sign not to go in, and you just need to take as much time as you have to learn how to do that. And that means writing crappy stories, and then writing okay stories, and eventually writing really good stories, and just persisting.
So yeah, I mean, I would second the thing about the business part. I think that one thing that was a bit difficult for me, especially once I went into the scholarly part, was, even though I'm still involved in the communication science, I'm not a scientist anymore. And that mindset, you spend so much time getting the PhD and you think of yourself one way, and then all of a sudden you are completely on the other side of things and you're thinking about money, which, a lot of scientists, there's obviously money in the form of grants and things like that, but, what you're doing is not motivated by revenue, as much, and publishers are under that pressure. At societies like the RSC, we're under that pressure because the revenue funds everything the society does. And this is true for all societies pretty much, that the publishing programs are the things that fund what they do. Membership dues and things like that are a much smaller percentage. So it's that switch in mindset, I think, that's probably fairly challenging if you've been in science and you've gone through all the way to get the PhD and pushed through, and then you get to the other side and, oh, I'm not actually a scientist anymore. So it's just a little bit weird.
Yeah, exactly that, basically. The other thing about the transition, I mean, I agree, but so I won't repeat it, but this wasn't a challenge. This was actually just sort of, for me, getting a PhD, and as I said, I was working full-time while I was doing the PhD, and it was a very solitary existence. So the transition to publishing was actually a relief in many ways. It is very social, and that was something, I guess I didn't realize how much I actually needed that until I was in it. But so that wasn't a difficult transition, but it was sort of a really nice surprise just how much this part of the job resonated with me. And yeah.
All right, we are going to take our last question. Possible? Go ahead.
I'm just wondering, in the transition to like online publications, how you guys are dealing with that, and like what new jobs are maybe created or new skills of programming or whatever that people working to go into publishing might want to have, and also like is it mostly like jobs really being eliminated, or is it that there are actually
Yeah, so I think that the answer to that question will be different for different publishers. I have actually transitioned about a year and a half ago. I transitioned from book publishing to digital reference publishing, and so in our department now at Oxford, we're actually creating these very large-scale digital encyclopedias and handbooks and bibliographies. Some of the products are only digital. Some of the products are kind of hybrid print and digital. So we're by no means abandoning print, and we certainly have the other departments outside of the reference at Oxford are still very actively publishing books. So those jobs aren't being replaced, but we're also adding digital components, and so it's kind of opening up possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's definitely still a growing industry. I don't think that journals are going to go anywhere, so the jobs associated with those are not going anywhere at the moment. But databases, I mentioned those briefly. Certainly there's room for a lot of experimentation in that area that's going to be driven by government policy, and it's a big problem. It's, okay, you've got the data, you can put it in a database. Well, now, is it useful that way? How do you, find it? If it's in 100 different formats, how do you pull the relevant information out? So problems like that, which are probably a bit more computer science based, like you said, are definitely things that are, I think, going to be developing in the industry more.
On the mainstream journalism side, it's a really good question, by the way, and I think it's a defining question for all of these areas. There's no question, like the digital transition has been incredibly rocky for mainstream journalists, and we're in the middle of a sort of 15-year-long revolution or crisis that just never really ends. And the truth is that newsroom staffs have been dwindling since the 90s. I don't want to sugarcoat any of this. It's something you should all kind of have your eyes open about if you decide to go into publishing or journalism. The old business models that worked really well for almost 100 years, namely subscriptions and advertising and classified ads, are gone. And people are having to figure out new ways to pay for quality journalism. And there will probably be a lot fewer major national and regional newspapers left standing at the end of this process, and fewer magazines. And so that means there are fewer staff positions being sought after by the same number of people. So anyway, it's a difficult time, but at the same time, the upside of it is that the underlying causes, which have to do with the internet and the access the internet enables, also give these amazing new tool sets to storytellers. So it's a time when you can also tell your stories in really extremely compelling new ways if you're willing to learn the skills. And you can reach your audiences much more directly without having to go through 100 editors and publishers and other middlemen to do that. So I think it's a really super exciting and super dangerous and traumatic time to be a journalist.
All right, let us thank our speakers one last time. Okay, there is food outside, and please feel free to mingle with the speakers. But just one last point, that we cannot bring food inside the classroom. And on behalf of GSC, thank you so much for coming. And also, ARC, the Academics Research and Career Committee, is going to host more of these alternative career panels throughout the spring semester. So please watch in for that. And if you have any suggestions on alternative careers that you would like to learn more about, please email us. Our email address is gsc-arc@mit.edu. And Catherine, on behalf of the MIT Libraries, also has some announcements.
Sorry, I know you all want to go eat. So I'm more specifically, I'm from the Office of Scholarly Publishing, Copyright and Licensing, and we are running a few more really great sessions during IAP in the next couple weeks. I just wanted to mention them to you. One of them next Wednesday, January 21st, is on using images in your work, a look at copyright, fair use, and open licensing. The following Monday, on January 26th, is thesis, specifications, and copyright issues. There are others related to data mining and publishing. Just go to the IAP site and look under libraries as the sponsor. And I've left some handouts at the front that may be useful too. They're on author rights and copyright, and have some information on how our office can help you out if you have questions about these issues. And my card is there as well. Thanks so much. And thank you to the speakers. It was wonderful.